Okay, so you know how we always talk about those like policy changes that kind of sneak up on you, little bits here and there.
Yeah.
Well, this one's like a total curveball. Like when I heard that former President Trump actually signed this executive order saying he wants to get rid of the entire Department of Education, I was like, seriously?
Yeah, it definitely made a lot of people do a double take. And for folks like you who are trying to keep up with the big changes in education, it's like, okay, what's the real deal here? Like, is this just a headline or is this like a signal of something much bigger?
Totally. You're busy. You don't have time to wade through a bunch of government jargon, right? We need that clear, concise understanding.
Exactly.
So that's what we're doing here. We're going to like totally unpack this whole thing, this executive order, what it really means and what could happen because of it. You ready for this?
Absolutely. You know what's really fascinating is that while this might have seemed like it came out of nowhere for some people, the idea of like shrinking down the Department of Education or even completely getting rid of it, well, that's been kind of a recurring theme among conservatives for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
So this executive order isn't like an isolated thing. It's connected to this whole like deeply held belief about how much the federal government should be involved in education.
Right. It's not like he just woke up one morning and was like, hey, let's do this.
Exactly.
I mean, picture this, okay? Trump in the White House East Room, surrounded by kids signing this order, and he's like, we're going to shut it down and shut it down as quickly as possible. It's doing us no good. We're going to return education back to the states where it belongs. Like, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, yeah, and it really gets to the heart of the philosophy behind all of this. It's this really strong belief in local control.
Right.
Like the idea is that individual states are way better equipped to understand and address the needs of their own students and their own education systems.
So obviously everyone's first question is like, is the Department of Education going to like vanish overnight?
Right.
And the short answer is, well, not really.
Not that simple.
There's this tiny little detail about Congress needing to agree to actually dissolve a federal department.
Right, that's the key thing to remember.
Okay.
But this executive order, it still has some teeth. Even if Congress doesn't say, okay, we're getting rid of it, the executive branch, they can start making moves to weaken the department.
Okay, so how do you like weaken a department without just getting rid of it?
Well, the most straightforward way is through budget cuts and staffing reductions. The executive order can basically tell agencies to start planning for these kinds of cutbacks.
Right.
And by cutting funding, you're basically limiting the department's ability to run federal education programs and to oversee them effectively.
Right.
And then the staffing reductions that directly impacts their capacity to do their job. So it's kind of like slowly deflating a tire. It might not go flat right away, but it's not going to work as well.
Right. It makes it harder to function.
Exactly.
Okay, so this whole thing didn't just happen out of the blue, right? There were some interesting players involved.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that kind of stands out is the reported role of Elon Musk and his like Department for Government Efficiency. You know, they call it DOGE.
DOGE.
Yeah. Now, the specific details of what we know publicly are kind of limited, but the suggestion is that Musk's team has been like advising on and maybe even helping implement parts of this whole effort to streamline the government. And the Department of Education was like one of their main targets.
DOGE. It sounds like something you'd see on like a satire website or something.
It does, right?
But apparently they've been like looking at efficiency across different agencies. It definitely adds a whole other layer of weirdness to this.
Right. It kind of underscores this focus on efficiency and this idea of maybe shrinking the size of the federal government overall.
Right.
Now, whether Musk being involved will lead to any big lasting changes, I mean, who knows?
Right.
But it's definitely a big piece of this puzzle.
And then there's the whole thing with Linda McMahon being appointed as Secretary of Education. And former President Trump even said he hopes she's the last person to ever hold that job.
Wow.
So you have someone who used to be in professional wrestling now potentially in charge of like dismantling federal education policy. That's some serious symbolism.
It sends a very clear message, for sure.
Right.
And then what she did after taking office, like there were all these reports of staff cuts within the department.
Right.
That really shows how serious they are about this and how quickly they want to move. And her public statements about like giving resources back to the states without all the bureaucracy of Washington, that goes right back to that idea we were talking about with local control.
So I'm guessing this whole announcement wasn't exactly met with cheers from everyone.
Oh, yeah.
I bet there were some pretty strong reactions, especially from Democrats and, groups that advocate for public education.
For sure. I mean, Senate Majority Leader Schumer called it a tyrannical power grab and one of the most destructive and devastating steps. I mean, that shows you how worried they are.
Yeah.
The big fear is that getting rid of the Department of Education could lead to inconsistencies between states, like different standards, less accountability for results,
Right.
and potentially it could hurt The most vulnerable students, the ones who really rely on federal support.
Okay, so what about the other side of the aisle? What did Republicans have to say about this?
Oh, they were on board right away, especially governors like DeSantis in Florida and Abbott in Texas. This aligns perfectly with the whole Republican idea of prioritizing state and local control over education.
Right.
Their argument is that a big centralized federal system is inefficient. It can't handle the different needs of different places, and it might have too much say in what's being taught in schools.
Right. And former President Trump even mentioned how American schools are falling behind in international rankings as a reason for making this move.
Yeah.
You hear that argument a lot, the idea that all this federal spending isn't actually making things better.
Right, that's a key part of their reasoning. The argument is that the current federal system just isn't working, and that a system where states are in charge would be more responsive and ultimately produce better results.
Right.
Now, people who disagree with this would say that just getting rid of the Department of Education doesn't automatically mean our schools are going to jump to the top of those international rankings, and they'd argue that it could actually make existing inequalities even worse.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it's a complex issue for sure.
So let's say this plan actually goes forward in some way. What parts of the federal government's role in education would likely stay in place? Because it doesn't sound like they're talking about getting rid of everything.
Yeah, that's right. The administration has said that some key federal functions, like the Federal Student Loan Program and financial aid for low-income students, those would probably stick around in some form. I mean, those are huge programs that affect tons of people.
Right.
Getting rid of them entirely would have massive consequences.
Yeah, huge ripple effect. But even so, it seems like the big picture is pretty clear. Like, former President Trump's press secretary Caroline Leavitt said the Department of Education will be much smaller than it is today.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then you have groups like the Heritage Foundation who are all about getting rid of the department. It really shows you the strong beliefs behind this.
Definitely.
So let's talk money for a second. Right now, the federal government contributes about 13% of the total funding for K through 12 education.
Right.
So you could argue that states are already carrying most of the financial burden. But that 13% from the feds, it seems like it goes towards very specific things.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That 13%, while it's a smaller piece of the pie, it often supports really crucial areas. Like federal funding is essential for schools in low-income communities through Title I programs.
Right.
It helps pay for services and support for students with disabilities under IDEA, and it helps ensure that schools are protecting civil rights. So the worry is that without that federal oversight and those dedicated funds, these vulnerable students could end up getting hurt the most.
Right. So it's not just about the overall amount. It's about where that federal money goes and the rules that come with it to make sure things are fair and that vulnerable students are protected.
Absolutely. And the potential loss of those safeguards and the funding behind them, that's a huge sticking point for the people who are against this whole thing.
Right. And it's interesting because this isn't the first time someone's tried to shake up a federal agency in a big way. Remember when they almost completely dismantled USAID?
Yeah.
And then a federal court stopped it.
Right.
So does that situation tell us anything about potential roadblocks for what they're trying to do with the Department of Education?
Yeah, it definitely raises some legal questions. The justification for basically restructuring or eliminating a whole federal department could be challenged in court, especially if people argue that it goes beyond what the president's allowed to do or that it steps on Congress's toes.
Okay.
So the USAID case shows us that these kinds of big executive actions can face legal pushback and even get blocked by the courts.
So even though the executive order is signed and it's clear what they want to do, actually getting rid of or drastically shrinking the Department of Education is probably going to be a long and complicated process. And there might even be lawsuits along the way.
Exactly. The executive order is a big first step, but it's definitely not the end of the story. Congress and the courts are going to have a lot of say in how this all plays out.
Okay, so let's recap. Former President Trump signs an executive order saying he wants to eliminate the Department of Education. This is driven by a long-held belief that states should have more control over education. Now, completely getting rid of the department would require Congress to sign off on it. But in the meantime, the strategy seems to be to cut funding and staff significantly. And we even have Elon Musk's DOGE reportedly involved in all of this.
Wow.
And Linda McMahon is now the Secretary of Education overseeing this potential downsizing. Now, Democrats and people who advocate for public education are strongly opposed to this. They're worried about how it could impact things like fairness and educational standards. Meanwhile, Republicans are generally in favor of this move towards giving states more power. Some federal functions, like federal student loans, might stick around, but the overall direction is pretty clear. They want a much smaller Department of Education. Groups that the Heritage Foundation are all for it, but others are concerned about what it could mean for vulnerable students.
Right.
And just like we saw with that whole USAID thing, this could end up in court too.
It's a lot to unpack, right? What's really striking to me is how these long-held ideological goals are coming together at this particular moment in time. And then you have people from outside the traditional government circles getting involved. It's a really unique situation.
It feels like a huge turning point for how education is managed in this country.
It really does. And it leaves us with this really important question for you to think about. So on one hand, you have the argument for giving states more power to run their own education systems. On the other hand, you have this idea that the federal government needs to be involved to ensure fairness, accountability, and that all students across all states have access to a quality education.
Right.
So what happens if this shift towards a much smaller federal role in education actually becomes permanent? What are the long-term consequences for our education system? And most importantly, what does it mean for students in different states? What happens to their opportunities? What happens to their outcomes?
Right.
This is a big, complicated issue with potentially huge implications, and it's something we're going to be watching unfold for years to come. So
Absolutely.
keep those thinking caps on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
And until next time, stay curious.
And stay informed.